there are victims of all of this. Both Peter Mandelson and Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor were very close to that circle. They owe it to the victims to go before Congress and say on oath what they know, what they were aware of, what happened and why.
What I describe as a lawyer is very clear evidence. Payments totaling $75,000 were made by Epstein to Mandelson. We have the bank statements. They look legitimate, unless it's an extraordinarily careful and well-planned fake.
The News Agents podcast is brought to you by HSBC UK, opening up a world of opportunity.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And it's John. Not quite in the same hemisphere as you two, but the story of Mandelson is extraordinary. He has been telling friends that the only reason he resigned or was sacked, he says he was sacked, he makes no bones about that, was because Downing Street panicked. And he says they knew everything about my relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And given the latest revelations, given the latest shoe to drop, there are so many new stories that have come out about whether Peter Mandelson was acting almost as a lobbyist for the banking industry when he was business secretary within the government and advising Epstein what leading bankers should be threatening the British government with if they don't withdraw their threat of a kind of, banker's bonus tax. That is an extraordinary position where you say, well, who is Peter Mandelson working for? The government or the banking industry? And then this allegation that he has leaked confidential government papers to Epstein after the financial crash when he was in the cabinet about what asset sales might soon be taking place. And, potentially the implication being, could any of Jeffrey Epstein's clients benefit from this? And then you'd have on top of that, him allegedly receiving money from Jeffrey Epstein, which he says he can't recall. I mean, if I received money of $75,000 from you, Emily, or you, Lewis, unlikely, I know, I think I'd remember it. And so there are all sorts of things where you think there is a lot of explaining to do. And so far, what we've heard from Peter Mandelson doesn't cut it.
And of course, that doesn't even include the category of what you might just call personal humiliation, putting pay once again to the idea, as Mandelson had claimed previously, that his friendship with Epstein had come to an end. The photos which were released over the weekend, which were allegedly taken in Jeffrey Epstein's Paris flat of Mandelson in his underwear, deeply humiliating. And just to expand on what you said again, John, that has emerged in some of these emails, let's just remember the big picture here. Peter Mandelson was the business secretary for Gordon Brown and the de facto deputy prime minister in 2009. There are files that are showing evidence that Mandelson advised Epstein on how JP Morgan, as you say, John, might lobby the government. And not only that, he even suggested that the head of the investment bank call the then Chancellor Alistair Darling and mildly threaten him. This is, as I say, an internal minister, the de facto deputy prime minister, advising Jeffrey Epstein to advise his client to mildly threaten the UK Chancellor. All after which, as we now know, thanks to the FT's reporting over the weekend, that Mandelson appears to have received tens of thousands of dollars from Epstein in 2003-04, and his partner allegedly receiving $10,000 roughly to pay for, of all things, an osteopathy course around the same time, I think in 2010, that these emails were sent.
So as of today, Monday, where are we? Well, last night about 10 o'clock, Peter Mandelson resigned from the Labour Party. Didn't go through Keir Starmer. From what we understand, he went straight to the head of the Labour Party and offered his resignation, said he didn't want to embarrass the party anymore. Notwithstanding that, he remains a peer of the realm. He is Lord Mandelson. He hasn't been to the Lords since he lost his job in Washington. And today we heard via the Prime Minister's spokesperson that Keir Starmer would like to see that peerage revoked, but it is still unclear as to whether he's going to initiate any formal act that would strip Peter Mandelson of his peerage. And frankly, today, I think the questions around Peter Mandelson are rather bigger than a title, and they go to the heart of as you say, whether he was actually involved in influencing government policy for billionaires, for paedophiles, for people in other states and other countries through his position at Gordon Brown's side. And just to put this in context for some of our younger viewers, listeners who don't know the ins and outs of Peter Mandelson, I mean, he has been at the very heart, at the very origin of the New Labour project. He's really one of the architects of New Labour from the mid-90s onwards, helped bring Tony Blair to power for that historic 3-term win. When the party was first in power, Peter Mandelson was called the minister without portfolio. In other words, he didn't have one direct job, but he attended cabinet, and then he was given various roles. And twice in government, he was sacked. He was sacked by Tony Blair for money-related, influence-related issues. And he was then reappointed years later, decades later, by Keir Starmer to be ambassador for Washington. And there were plenty of people at the time, there were plenty of people around Keir Starmer who were saying, we know about Mandelson's relationship to Epstein.
Bad idea, Keir.
It's a bad idea, Keir. And for reasons that we still do not fully understand, Keir Starmer felt able to ignore those voices around him and appointed him as ambassador. And the stuff that's coming out now, and the stuff that you've pointed to, Lewis, which is about influencing tax policy because you have been asked to by billionaires from whom you have received money. He says he has no recollection. In fact, he says he's going to investigate himself. He's going to start an investigation by me to see if he was paid by Epstein or not. Fine. But the fact that all that was coming from somebody at the heart of Downing Street, it's worse than just being a friend of a dodgy guy.
Well, and bear in mind, just briefly, bear in mind, of course, that when those emails are being sent, that is around the time and just after the time that Epstein had received his conviction.
He was staying in Epstein's flat. He was literally living in Epstein's house in New York whilst Epstein was in an open prison on charges of child prostitution.
And look, this is where it gets to, this all happened in 2008, 2009, or whenever it was, a long time ago when Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister. But it does matter to Keir Starmer today because, look at two events in parallel. You've got the King stripping Prince Andrew of his titles and he becomes Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. And you've now got Keir Starmer saying, well, I think that Peter Mandelson should be stripped of his peerage and I sacked him anyway as our ambassador to Washington. To which the obvious point is, well, the King didn't have any option of appointing Prince Andrew. He was born, he gets the title Prince Andrew, and, that's just the way it is with the royal family. Keir Starmer had a choice in appointing Peter Mandelson as our ambassador to Washington. And there were many people in government and there were many people in the security services who said, whoa, are you sure about this? Now, Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff at Number 10, close friend of Peter Mandelson, was the person who pushed this through. He is still the chief of staff at Number 10 Downing Street. And given what we have learned over the last weekend, there are some pretty serious questions for Keir Starmer to answer and for Morgan McSweeney to answer about, well, why didn't you listen? Why didn't you let the vetting process go through its full kind of course before reappointing Peter Mandelson, given everything we have learned since then?
I think, John, you're right. This is, in one sense, an old story, but it has deeply contemporary political consequences. I think on two categories. One you've already identified, which is about Morgan McSweeney and the Prime Minister's judgments. Understanding is that, Starmer himself was, who'd always had a more frosty relationship with Mandelson, more reluctant to appoint him initially, was prevailed upon eventually on the advice of Morgan McSweeney. McSweeney and Mandelson have been very politically close over the years, close political allies. McSweeney is not without enemies within the Labour Party, particularly on the soft left of the Labour Party. And I've no doubt whatsoever that there will be people around Starmer who are saying that McSweeney, this hastens the date at which McSweeney has to go. But even if you leave aside the questions of judgment, there are questions for him right now. I noticed from the lobby briefing this afternoon, the Prime Minister building on what he said yesterday, because the Prime Minister chose on his return from the Far East at the weekend, saying that he thought that Andrew should go and testify before Congress. He now says that he thinks Mandelson should testify before Congress, but also says that he should no longer be a member of the House of Lords, as we've been saying, but also saying that the PM, his spokesperson saying, does not have the power to remove the title, and has called on the Lords to modernise its disciplinary procedures for those bringing the House into disrepute. That's just not true. The Prime Minister is in effect the only person who can remove the title, in the sense that the only way that you can remove someone from the peerage is via an Act of Parliament, something which is rare but has been done before. So the Prime Minister is the only one. He's affecting powerlessness, saying, I'd like to see this, but I can't affect it. That's not true. He's the only one who can affect it by making use of government time on the floor of the House of Commons. And I actually think, just to bring back very briefly, John, just to connect the Andrew and the Mandelson story here, although we say that the King stripped Andrew of his titles, in a day-to-day sense that is true, but actually he remains a duke, and he remains not the prince, but all of the other titles he continues to have. He's just not using them. That would require also an Act of Parliament, and I think there was a bit of a slightly grubby agreement, really, or a de facto one, between the Palace and Number 10 when this question came up, because what's one of the reasons that neither the Palace nor Number 10 would have wanted an Act of Parliament to go before to strip Andrew of his titles? It's because they were afraid that a Conservative or someone else would have laid down an amendment to that bill saying the same about Mandelson, or Labour Republican MPs would have put down amendments putting questions down about royal finances and what the royal family knew about Andrew at the time. So I think that there has been a bit of a culture of opacity both at Number 10 and at the Palace on this, and I think it's coming back to sting both of them.
I hear what you're saying, but I just think we are so way beyond titles at this point. Why are we talking about whether there'll be a rehabilitation of a political career? I mean, not us, but outside there are still people talking about whether, will Mandelson come back? Will he have another job in government? What will be the ramifications for Keir Starmer? I mean, it's nonsense. Is there going to be a criminal investigation? Is there going to be accountability before Congress or before a court of law? I sort of just don't care enough about the titles. And I think the problem with where we've got to now on the Epstein files, and we understand what's happened over the weekend, there's been a drop of 3 million pages, right? And we understand that's only half the amount. And it's sort of bamboozling because you don't know who to start with, you don't know where to start, you don't know whether it's the chronology, you don't know whether it's the association, you don't know whether it's the crimes. It's very hard to find your way through this. But I think the trouble is you kind of get taken down sort of rabbit holes. Maybe you don't think they're rabbit holes, and I understand why you feel very strongly about the sort of importance of the royal titles in this. But what I would say is, every time you're having that argument, you're not having the argument about people actually facing the power of the law in this. We've got all this way, we haven't mentioned the victims, we haven't mentioned the women, we haven't mentioned the children at the time, and we haven't mentioned the fact that apart from Ghislaine, who's in prison, rightfully so, and Andrew, who has been kind of disgraced and fallen from public life, very few people have had any ramifications from this whatsoever. And it does seem to me that the urgency now is to get anyone, and I'm not saying they are guilty, I'm saying let's just hear what they know. Let's just bring them before Congress, or let's just hear them testify so we understand what they can actually tell us.
Well, I agree with you in one sense that the title stuff is a sideshow, but I'll just make sort of 3 points. I think the titles are a cipher to a wider issue, which is that, well, for a start, the only reason that these people were of interest to Epstein in the first place was their title and was their position, and the fact that someone like Mandelson is a member of the House of Lords.
Influence,
and
what that title, confers. Influence.
Yes, yeah. But I think these two things are very, closely fused. Yeah. The fact that Andrew was a prince and remains being a duke. And I do think that the Palace has quite deliberately conflated and sort of muddied the water slightly about this question because they haven't wanted to go through the Act of Parliament. And I'll just say, what I mean is that what I think this whole thing reveals, what's the common denominator behind this story, which I think is basically behind the title question? It is about a culture of opacity and a lack of transparency time and time again. We see that in politics. We see it in the royal family. You know, when allegations about Andrew first emerged, there was no contemporaneous transparency. We've not seen there's been no independent inquiry from the palace. We're talking all about this now about, you know, what the political implications should be for number 10, and we're talking about what it will be for Parliament and whether Mandelson should use his peerage. Let's not forget, the royal family have never had, as far as we know, any inquiry into Andrew and who knew what when, or any institutional inquiry as far as we know either, and a complete lack of opacity throughout. So I think that the titles are important because I think that they advert to a wider culture of secrecy and a lack of transparency.
I do think that, further to your point, Emily, that if Peter Mandelson is asked to go before the Oversight Committee at the House of Representatives and doesn't, and Andrew doesn't, I think it would be a shameful decision because, as you say, there are victims of all of this. There is one person in prison, Ghislaine Maxwell, and that is it. And Epstein committed suicide, according to official records. Maybe he was killed, who knows? But there is so little accountability for all the things that have happened. And if there are two people who knew Epstein well, and what these files and this disclosure of these millions of documents show is that both Peter Mandelson and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor were very close to that circle, then they owe it to the victims to go before Congress and say on oath what they know, what they were aware of, what happened and why.
Well, let's talk to Dan Neidle now. He's a tax expert with a forensic eye for detail, and he has been going through the Epstein files relating to Mandelson, and he has found stuff that starts with tax and takes us into a whole different sphere. Dan, just talk us through what you found.
So, December 2009, we'd gone through the first part of the financial crisis, and there was a popular feeling that the banks had to pay. And in response to that, in December 2009, that the government announced a tax on bank bonuses. This, of course, created a tsunami of lobbying by the banks against this proposal. And Lord Mandelson was involved in this lobbying. Nothing unusual for someone to be involved in lobbying, but of course he was a senior member of the government at that point. He discussed with Epstein whether the bank payroll tax could be amended to become less damaging to JP Morgan. And it's clear from the emails that Lord Mandelson had been discussing this with Jess Staley, who was then a senior JP Morgan executive with close links to Epstein. So that's the first that we see. And that feels inappropriate for a government minister to be advising a bank how to lobby against government policy.
Dan, if you were being generous, could you just say it is the role of the business secretary to be the ear to all businesses about policies that concern them and try and work out what the best government policy is to kind of keep them on side?
You can absolutely say that. And this email is almost that. It seems to go a bit further because it's behind the scenes. Because presumably when Lord Mandelson then spoke to Alistair Darling, then Chancellor, he didn't say, and I've been asked to make this point by JP Morgan. So it feels an inappropriate version of that, but it is a version of that.
I suppose, Dan, the other point is to bear in mind here, the reason why many people are questioning this is because clearly the other thing that we know from the FT's reporting on this over the weekend is that it appears, although Mandelson is saying that he has no record or recollection of it, it appears that through the 2000s and beyond, Mandelson and his partner were in receipt of funds from Epstein. And so clearly there is a potential conflict, a profound conflict of interest there.
Yes, there is. What I describe as a lawyer is very clear evidence that in 2003 and 2004, payments totaling $75,000 were made by Epstein to Mandelson. We have the bank statements. I know what bank statements look like. They look legitimate, unless it's an extraordinarily careful and well-planned fake. That was 2003, 2004. But then around the time of these discussions in late 2009, Epstein agreed to fund Mandelson's partner's osteopathy course. The total amount he funded isn't clear, but it was somewhere over $10,000. So yes, that also makes this not normal behaviour for someone acting as the ear of business. 2 days after those emails around lobbying the government, Epstein sent Mandelson an email, this is 17 December 2009, asking, should Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, call Alistair Darling one more time. So Epstein is asking Mandelson advice on how JP Morgan should lobby government. And Mandelson responds, yes, and mildly threaten. And that is extraordinary.
And when Peter Mandelson told us this weekend that he had no recollection of those payments and didn't believe they were true, but he would carry out an investigation himself, what would your response be to that?
It reminded me of O.J. Simpson saying he was going to find the real killer. Yes, I'm sure Peter Mandelson will be closely investigating these 75,000 that he can't remember. That seems very plausible to me.
You just don't believe it?
No, it's ridiculous. I remember, maybe I was too young to remember clearly, but I remember Peter Mandelson being good at this sort of stuff. The denials he's coming out with now wouldn't fool a precocious 10-year-old. They're ridiculous.
And then there's this email, which the Times has dug up, where he leaks what looks like confidential government information about selling off what he calls saleable assets from the government, and he leaks that to Epstein. What I'm trying to ascertain, I guess, is, I mean, in your head, does this amount to criminal behaviour if it's proved right?
So there is a criminal offence of misconduct in public office, and that is not my area of expertise. I can say what the offence is. It's committed if you have a public officer, which Mandelson was, acting as a public officer, which I think he was when he forwarded the emails. I don't know if he was during those discussions around lobbying government. They willfully misconduct themselves or recklessly misconduct themselves to such an degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust and without reasonable excuse or justification. And it's not my area. I can't tell you if that offence is satisfied by the facts here, but I can say that it looks a serious enough point that someone who has expertise, preferably in the Crown Prosecution Service, should be looking at it.
And that is something that you could be jailed for?
Yeah, it's a serious criminal offence. And whilst it's couched in Victorian language and it's a common law offence rather than written in statute, it's absolutely used most commonly against corrupt councillors. There's no reason it can't be used against a minister. Sorry,
Dan, do you think he should be investigated by the police?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, the Crown Prosecution Service should confirm if the law potentially applies to the facts as they appear to be, and then it should be investigated.
Dan, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much. Good luck.
Look, Mandelson will be in agony over this. He thought he would do an interview with Laura Kuenssberg. He thought that would clear the air. There were many people who advised him against it, saying you don't know what else is going to come out. And sure enough, a hell of a lot has come out. Peter Mandelson wanted a rehabilitation into public life. You know, he was telling friends, you know, there is another peg I want to be able to hang my coat on. And he has got a list of villains in all of this that, you know, Downing Street panicked and the Foreign Office were against him. And he even talked about the sisterhood in the Labour Party being against him, whatever that means. And I think that Mandelson must now be realising that any hopes of this rehabilitation are in absolute tatters right now, given what we have learned, given the questions that remain unanswered. And rather than the kind of questions diminishing, there's just an ever-growing number of questions, and each question begs more questions. And so I think that, you know, for Mandelson, he must be reappraising everything right now.
I have to say my blood runs cold when you talk about the sisterhood getting the blame, because if men realised how hard women question themselves before they go into public life, because they think about all the shit they're going to get and all the harassment and all the scrutiny and all the sort of focus, and most of the time, as we know, they think it's not worth it and they don't do it. And then you get somebody like Peter Mandelson who goes back time and time again because there is absolutely no sense of impunity, that it doesn't matter if you took a loan without declaring it, that it doesn't matter if you or your partner have taken money from a paedophile billionaire, that it doesn't matter if you're staying in a convicted paedophile's flat, presumably rent-free, that it doesn't matter if you want to be ambassador to the US, whether or not you've had this ongoing relationship with him, that none of that really should be held against you, that somehow it's the sisterhood of your own party that is trying to bring you down because they just wish you ill. They don't want you to succeed. I'm sorry, it just beggars belief to hear that phrase.
Well, I think one of the ironies of all of this, and in a way, Mandelson's own future is of such trivial importance by comparison to all the things you've just said, Emily, and obviously the sort of wider questions that are posed by Epstein in his relationship with so many global political, business, commercial, royal elites, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But I think it is obviously one of the sort of deepest, darkest ironies of all of this is that, you know, people have talked about Mandelson as being one of the most effective political and media operators of his generation of the last 30 years. And I think one thing that we are seeing with all of this, not least in how he has responded to it repeatedly in the most extraordinary, and I think many would say occasionally outrageous way, shows that if that reputation was once deserved,
tone deaf.
It is no longer.
Absolutely tone deaf.
We'll be back with more just after this. Moving away from the specifics of Peter Mandelson and even Andrew, I think one of the things that just kind of like was hammered home to me once again, Emily, and you've been following this in more detail for longer than me, so maybe this didn't hit you quite as much as it did me. But every time the tranches appear now from the DOJ, and of course we should remind ourselves, we're only seeing these documents because of an act of Congress that was passed, compelling, because it's become such a kind of cause célèbre on the MAGA right, compelling the Department of Justice to publish these millions and millions of documents. Every time they drop, I am just reminded and astonished at how far and how deep Epstein's tentacles ran across global elites across the world, whether it is political, commercial, royal, you name it. This man, who to most of us was completely unknown, at the centre of the social and political lives of so many of the most famous and well-known and influential people around the world. This man, and indeed, many of them maintaining that relationship after he had had a conviction for child prostitution. So just a reminder in terms of some other things that we learned in the weekend from the latest millions of files. Trump is in there repeatedly again in social records from the early 1990s and early 2000s. Lots of very lurid allegations about him. He continues to deny them. Bill Gates mentioned in emails written by Epstein alleging Gates contracted an STD and tried to conceal it from his wife. Gates has denied that. Bill Clinton, appearing much as before in flight logs, social contact. Add in Prince Andrew, these new pictures that have emerged of him crouching over a woman. Les Wexner, the financier. Leon Black, the financier. Ehud Barak, the Israeli politician. Alan Dershowitz, the very famous American lawyer. It isn't necessarily that we learn loads that is new in each case, but what we see again and again is Epstein talking, trading, trafficking, access with the most powerful people around the world, as I say, very often, even after the fact that they knew that he was a paedophile.
Yeah, and the problem with 3 million documents in one go is that there will be a lot of complete rubbish in there. And there'll be a lot of stuff that is unverified, and there'll be a lot of testament from people that has been taken down but probably not believed. And a lot of people appear in the Epstein files, including, full disclosure, the newsagents. I mean, you can actually find...
This is our last episode.
Our names mentioned. You can find reference to interview bids that we have made with Epstein victims in there. So you've got a sense of just how wide-ranging this is, where they have basically dumped every single bit of communication that has been through. But as you say, Epstein's tentacles are ferociously deep and wide. One of the stories that has now come out is that Epstein hired a London lobbyist to try and make Jess Staley, who was at JP Morgan, head of Barclays. In other words, he was externally trying to manipulate people like George Osborne, who was the Chancellor, and Mervyn King, who was the Governor of the Bank of England, to say this would be a great fit. You know, he was actually trying to lobby people in the British government, in the British establishment, to get his mate this job. And I just want to direct you to an extraordinary press conference moment. This is Todd Blanche. He's the Deputy Attorney General. He works for Pam Bondi, who at this point looks as if she's been slightly sidelined. And he was talking about the kind of things that have been redacted from the files. In other words, the stuff that we are not seeing.
Any depiction of CSAM or child pornography was obviously excluded. anything that would jeopardize an active federal investigation. And finally, anything that depicts or contain images of death, physical abuse, or injury, also not produced.
I mean, sorry, just what? Just rewind that. So they were coming across stuff that showed death, physical injury, and clearly child pornography. Now, Todd Blanche, totally understand that you will redact this stuff. We, the public, do not need to see those images. But please tell us that you're now going after the people that seem to be the perpetrators of whatever you have just redacted. Please tell us that you're not just putting it to one side and saying we can't show that there is some process now underway. Because the scariest thing about all this, and we referred to it a bit in the first half, is that the drips and drabs come out. We're left trying to make a narrative. We're left trying to say, well, is that true or is that not true? But meanwhile, the actual authorities, the Department of Justice, think their job is done. They're not doing anything. They're not pursuing people in this. They're saying, well, we said we'd release the files. There you go. Hands off. I hope that's not true. But we're waiting to see whether anything actually comes of this, whether there is any criminal prosecution as a result of this.
I think one of the ways that a lot of people will respond to this, or at least it's the way I respond to it, is actually a sort of astonishment and a feeling that this might vindicate a lot of the very worst fears that you have about global power elites, right?
Yeah.
Which is that basically it does feel like one massive club and one massive
Cover-up.
kind of cover-up between.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it gets... you can completely understand how people and why people get to a conspiratorial mindset. It doesn't feel conspiratorial at that point, right? Let's bear in mind, again, this extraordinary, and I mean that in the literal sense, rather than obviously any complimentary sense, but this extraordinary character of Epstein, even his money, the way that he peddled his influence was through his fortune. And even his $600 million fortune is still completely shrouded in mystery. We basically don't know. We always say the disgraced financier, Jeffrey Epstein. It's like, well, yeah, except he's not like he was like a traditional hedge fund manager, or there's not an actual paper trail of where he got most of his money. Some of that money, we know its provenance, but a lot of it we don't. And a lot of these people with whom he was basically literally using that money, like with Mandelson, to peddle his influence, also presumably didn't know either. They didn't ask. They didn't care, because ultimately he provided them, it seems, with a means to a lifestyle and a means to a world that they otherwise would not be able to obtain. I mean, just as a kind of like little aside, just I think that kind of illustrates just how bizarrely well connected this guy was. It hasn't received much attention here, but because, as some listeners will know, my wife's Norwegian, I've sort of heard about it over the weekend. The Norwegian papers have been dominated this weekend by the fact that the princess, the crown princess, their equivalent of Kate, right, the Princess of Wales, Mette Marit, has herself been, this is a woman who at the time when she knew Epstein was like in her late 30s, has herself been dragged into this entire affair because it's emerged that she exchanged emails with Epstein years after he pleaded guilty to charges that included soliciting prostitution from a minor. She said to Epstein, among other things, that, Jeffrey, you tickle my brain. She called him soft-hearted. She called him such a sweetheart. She said he was very charming. She suggested that Paris would be a great place for him to have affairs.
Can I read one of these out?
And
is it inappropriate for a mother to suggest two naked women carrying a surfboard for my 15-year-old son's wallpaper?
It's so
weird.
It is. And also...
that was her to Epstein.
And also, she also included the emails. The files included an email from 2011, so again, he's been out of prison for a little while by now, in which Princess Mette Marit told Epstein that she'd Googled him, adding, "It didn't look good," along with a smiling emoji. Like, this just brings home that even for a woman in this case, someone in the Norwegian royal family of all things, basically, let's be honest, at this global political elite level, they just weren't bothered about someone being a paedophile.
Yeah.
I don't know any other conclusion.
How to explain? I mean, just the countries you've taken us through there. So Norway, Britain, Israel, France,
US,
Jean-Luc Brunel, the
obviously.
US, Slovakia. I don't think we've covered even 5%, really? 4% of what is out there now.
I think this is what's so hard as a story to get your head around, which is how this one relatively unknown guy, certainly in terms of his public reputation, could have so successfully
Outsized
embedded
influence,
himself at the heart of global political and economic elites, and have basically, and not only, I mean, that would be, if he was a completely legit guy, that in itself would raise questions, right? That someone that, okay, let's say there's no criminality, obviously no paedophilia, no sexual inappropriateness, but that like he would be using his money to peddle influence or whatever. That would be like actually one set of questions. But given who he was, and given that they all knew by the 2010s who he was, it becomes astonishing.
I feel like we have to now go back and say, who else was paid money? I mean, in public life, who else was appointed by him? Which other government policies in whichever country we're talking about were actually influenced or created by him? He seems to have had this sort of godlike position.
Mesmeric for people.
I mean, I don't... godlike is wrong, because I don't mean that he was a god at all. I just mean that he ended up having this potency over so many people, so many jurisdictions, and so much money, that means we are only just now beginning to understand how much of the world was controlled. And to your point, yeah, we now sound like the conspiracists. We now sound like the crazy people.
Like a tangled web.
Right,
but it is a web. But it is.
It is. And he's literally at the top of it and in the centre of it all. It does strike me, Lewis, that actually Keir Starmer wouldn't have to send his troops out to talk about this right now, because it is like the hot button issue for the government today, if he hadn't appointed Mandelson to Washington when he had all that information, if not at his fingertips, then just beyond his fingertips, within reach. And I mean, we should add that the reason that Mandelson got the peerage in the first place was because Gordon Brown was in trouble. He was facing David Cameron at the next election, and he basically decided that he needed Mandelson back in his cabinet, pretty much as his election supremo. Mandelson by that stage didn't have a seat, wasn't an MP, had just been the EU commissioner, and so he brought him into the cabinet via the Lords, which is this sort of quirk of, the Constitution, essentially, which means that if you're in the House of Lords, you can take a seat in cabinet, a bit like David Cameron did, of course, when he was Foreign Secretary.
Mandelson said it would be third time lucky.
And he wore that extraordinary V-neck jumper. Do you remember?
Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing we could not get over at the time. I don't think we realised the
Simpler
ramifications.
days.
I know, simpler days. It was a sort of purple V-neck jumper. And he walked in, and that was... He was meant to be basically bolstering Brown's chances of winning 2010. And now we're hearing from Darren Jones, who is right in the middle of trying to explain why this is tarnishing so much of Starmer's government right now.
Yes, so Darren Jones making a statement in the House of Commons at 4:30. It is extraordinary again, just the tentacles, the long shadow that is still being cast. I mean, Epstein's now been dead for, 6 years? Obviously, his crimes will live on for many decades still. But it was that act of Starmer, and it was ultimately down to Starmer, to bring Mandelson in, which has meant that those tentacles of Epstein are now extending still into number 10 Downing Street. And that number 10 itself is finding that it is having to deal with political fallout from the Epstein files, that had they not made that decision, there would have been maybe some political pressure with these files being released about whether Mandelson should remain a Labour peer and all of that. But that would have been at arm's length, far away. As it is, the Epstein scandal is in effect at the heart of Downing Street, and they're having to deal with it and to ensure that it does not become bigger still.
We'll be back tomorrow.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.